The dimly lit room was cold and silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the soft clink of a glass against the table. Amanda sat in the plush leather chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Her emerald green eyes glinted with a sharp, calculating light as she reviewed the document in her hands. Across from her, a man in a rumpled suit sat nervously, wiping sweat from his brow. "You assured me," Amanda said, her voice cold as ice, "that this would be taken care of. Now you're telling me there's a problem?" The man stammered, his words faltering under her piercing gaze. I didn't expect him to fight back. He's not cooperating, and it's—" Amanda's hands shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising force. Her nails dug into his skin, making him wince. "You listen to me," she hissed, leaning closer. "You don't let anyone stand in our way. Do you understand? If this falls apart because of your incompetence, you'll wish you'd never met me." The man nodded frantically, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead. Amanda released his wrist, straightening her posture with an air of unsettling calm. "Good," she said, her lips curling into a chilling smile. "Now go fix it. And remember, I don't tolerate failure." The man scrambled to his feet and rushed out of the room, leaving Amanda alone. She picked up her glass of wine, swirling the crimson liquid thoughtfully. The room felt darker now, the shadows stretching ominously across the walls. Amanda's smile remained, but her eyes were devoid of warmth. She was already planning her next move. The next day, the warm sun shone brightly over the small suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the picket fences and manicured lawns. Inside the cozy Matthews home, 10-year-old Jake sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, tinkering with a miniature robot kit. The whirring sound of gears and the occasional beep filled the air as he concentrated on aligning tiny wires. "Jake, can you come here for a second?" called his father, Michael, from the kitchen. Jake set down his project with a sigh. His father's voice had that particular tone, the one he used when he wanted Jake to meet someone new. It had been just the two of them since Jake's mother had passed away 3 years ago, and Michael had recently started dating again. Jake wasn't sure how he felt about that. As Jake entered the kitchen, he saw Michael standing beside a striking woman with auburn hair and a dazzling smile. Her green eyes sparkled as she extended a hand toward Jake. "You must be Jake," she said warmly. "I've heard so much about you." "I'm Amanda." Jake hesitated before shaking her hand. There was something about her smile that seemed too perfect, like it was rehearsed. "Hi," he said quietly, his eyes flickering to his dad for reassurance. Michael's face was lit up with a grin. "Jake, Amanda and I have been seeing each other for a while now. I wanted you to meet her because she's very special to me." "Special?" Jake echoed, his voice skeptical. Amanda laughed lightly. "Well, I hope we can be friends too. Your dad says you're incredibly smart." Jake shrugged, unsure how to respond. "I guess." Michael ruffled Jake's hair. "How about we all go out for ice cream later? It'll be fun." Jake nodded reluctantly, but his gut churned with unease. Amanda's smile lingered a moment too long, as if she was studying him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The days following Amanda's introduction to Jake passed smoothly, at least on the surface. Amanda continued to charm everyone around her. She brought homemade cookies to the neighbors, joined Michael on his morning jogs, and even attended one of Jake's school soccer games, cheering enthusiastically from the sidelines. But Jake couldn't shake the creeping unease that lingered every time Amanda was near. One evening, as Jake sat at the dining table working on his homework, Amanda walked into the room. She set a steaming cup of hot chocolate in front of him, her smile as warm as the drink. "I thought you might like this," she said, brushing an invisible speck off her perfectly pressed blouse. "It's your favorite, right?" Jake stared at the cup, hesitating before muttering, "Thanks." Amanda took a seat across from him, folding her hands neatly. "How's school? Your dad tells me you're great at science." "It's okay," Jake replied cautiously, his pencil hovering over his notebook. He couldn't tell if her interest was genuine or just another layer of her too perfect facade. "You know," Amanda continued, her voice soft and sweet, "I've always admired kids who are passionate about learning. It's such a great quality." Jake nodded, but kept his focus on his homework. He felt her eyes on him, studying him like a hawk observing its prey. Later that night, Jake overheard Amanda's voice drifting from the living room. She was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. The tone was different now, sharp and deliberate, devoid of the warmth she displayed around his dad. "He's too perceptive for his own good," Amanda whispered. "Yes, I'm handling it. Just make sure everything is ready for the next step. We can't afford mistakes." Jake's breath hitched. He pressed himself closer to the wall, straining to hear more. "Michael is completely under my thumb," Amanda continued, her voice laced with amusement. "But the boy, he's going to be a problem if we're not careful." The sound of footsteps made Jake retreat hastily to his room. He slipped under the covers, heart pounding, as he replayed her words in his head. Who was she talking to? What couldn't they afford to mess up? The next day, Jake decided to follow Amanda. After school, instead of heading home, he trailed her discreetly as she drove to a nearby cafe. From his hiding spot behind a newspaper stand, he watched her meet with a man he didn't recognize. The man was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and a leather jacket that made him look like he belonged in a spy movie. Amanda handed him an envelope, her expression serious. The man flipped through the contents briefly before nodding and slipping it into his pocket. They exchanged a few more words Jake couldn't hear before parting ways. Jake's heart raced. He hurried home, mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What was in the envelope? And why was Amanda hiding so much from his dad? That evening, Jake tried to talk to Michael. "Dad, do you know anything about Amanda's friends?" he asked casually as they sat down to dinner. Michael looked up from his plate, surprised by the question. "Friends? Not really. She mentioned a few colleagues from her old job, but why do you ask?" Jake hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I just wondered. She seems really secretive sometimes." Michael chuckled, brushing it off. "That's just Amanda. She's a private person." "Nothing wrong with that." Jake nodded but didn't push further. He knew his dad wouldn't believe him without proof, and proof was exactly what he intended to find. Jake's curiosity was now a burning fire. Amanda's behavior was too polished, her moments of warmth too rehearsed. Every encounter felt like a puzzle piece he couldn't yet fit into place. Her whispered phone call and the mysterious man at the cafe gnawed at him, leaving him unable to focus on anything else. If he wanted to protect his dad, he had to dig deeper. A few days later, Jake found his opportunity. Amanda had left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter while she chatted with Michael in the backyard. Jake's heart thudded as he reached for it, the screen lighting up under his touch. To his relief, it wasn't locked. A quick scroll through her messages revealed nothing suspicious, but her call history caught his attention. The same number appeared several times, marked only by an initial. V. Jake jotted the number down quickly before setting the phone back in its original position. He hurried upstairs, locking his door behind him. Sitting at his desk, he plugged the number into an online reverse phone lookup tool. The result was a name, Victor Kane. That evening, Jake decided to follow Amanda again. He had seen her prepare to leave and overheard her tell Michael she was going to meet a friend for coffee. Jake grabbed his bike and tailed her car at a safe distance. She drove to a part of town Jake rarely visited, a quiet street lined with old warehouses. From behind a row of dumpsters, Jake watched as Amanda stepped into one of the buildings. Minutes later, she emerged with a tall man in a black coat, Victor Kane. Jake's breath caught. Victor handed Amanda a briefcase and she opened it briefly to inspect its contents. From his vantage point, Jake couldn't see what was inside, but Amanda's satisfied nod made it clear she approved. They exchanged a few words before parting ways. Amanda returned to her car, but Victor lingered, pulling out a phone and making a call. Jake strained to hear but caught only snippets. The payout. After the wedding, no loose ends. His stomach churned. He didn't know the full extent of their plans. But one thing was clear. Amanda and Victor were up to no good, and his dad was at the center of it. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He replayed everything he'd seen and heard, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a dark picture. Amanda's overly sweet demeanor, her secretive calls, the meeting with Victor, it all pointed to something bigger. but how could he prove it? The next morning, Jake decided to search Amanda's belongings. It was risky, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. While Amanda and Michael were out grocery shopping, Jake slipped into her room. His pulse raced as he opened her closet, rummaging through the neat rows of clothes and shoes. In the back corner, hidden beneath a stack of scarves, he found a small, locked box. He searched the room for a key, eventually finding one tucked inside her jewelry case. With trembling hands, he unlocked the box. Inside were several documents, bank statements, fake IDs, and a marriage license application with Michael's name on it. But one item stood out, a handwritten note that read, Phase 1, gain his trust. Phase 2, secure the marriage. Phase 3, access the estate, no mistakes. Jake's hands shook as he put the documents back and locked the box. He hurried to return everything to its original place, careful not to leave any trace of his intrusion. As he exited the room, he felt a surge of determination. Amanda wasn't just lying to his dad. She was planning to take everything from him. And that evening, Jake sat down with his notebook, writing everything he had discovered so far. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself much longer. But he also knew Amanda was watching him closely. One misstep, and she'd know he was onto her. He needed a plan and allies. As he stared at the page filled with his scribbled notes, an idea began to form. There was one person in the neighborhood who might believe him, Mr. Hargrove, the retired detective who lived next door. Jake had heard his dad call him paranoid more than once, but Jake figured that might be exactly what he needed. Tomorrow he'd pay Mr. Hargrove a visit. The next morning, Jake stood on the porch of the weathered brick house next door. He clutched his notebook tightly, his heart pounding as he rang the doorbell. The faint chime echoed inside, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. The door creaked open to reveal Mr. Hargrove, a tall, wiry man with graying hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to size Jake up instantly. Well, well, Mr. Hargrove said, leaning against the doorframe. To what do I owe this honor, Jake? Jake hesitated, swallowing hard before blurting out, I need your help. It's about Amanda. I think she's hiding something. Mr. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from bemusement to curiosity. Come on in, kid. Let's hear it. Jake followed him into the dimly lit living room, cluttered with stacks of newspapers and books about crime and law enforcement. Mr. Hargrove gestured for Jake to sit on the worn leather couch while he settled into an armchair. Start from the beginning, he said, his tone serious now. Jake opened his notebook, recounting everything. Amanda's secretive behavior, the mysterious phone calls, the meeting with Victor, and the incriminating documents he'd found. As he spoke, Mr. Hargrove leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. You've got a good head on your shoulders, kid, Mr. Hargrove said when Jake finished. But this is dangerous. If she's who you think she is, you'll need solid evidence before you go to your dad. Otherwise, she'll turn this around on you. Jake nodded. That's why I came to you. I don't know what else to do. Mr. Hargrove tapped his chin thoughtfully. We'll need to play this smart. She's already got your dad wrapped around her finger, so any direct confrontation is out. What we need is proof. Proof your dad can't ignore. Over the next few days, Mr. Hargrove and Jake worked together to gather evidence. They set up a small camera in the living room, concealed behind a bookshelf, to capture Amanda's behavior when Michael wasn't around. Mr. Hargrove also used his connections to look into Victor Kane, uncovering a string of fraud charges and suspicious disappearances tied to his name. One evening, Jake found himself sneaking into Amanda's room while she was downstairs cooking dinner. His hands shook as he rummaged through her belongings, careful not to disturb anything too obviously. He froze when he heard footsteps approaching the staircase. Holding his breath, Jake slipped into the closet, barely closing the door in time. Amanda entered the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Jake peeked through the slats of the closet door, his heart pounding so loudly he feared she might hear it. She paused, glancing around suspiciously before retrieving her phone from the nightstand and leaving. Jake waited a full minute before emerging, his knees weak but his resolve stronger. Jake's nerves were on edge every time Amanda walked into the room. He forced himself to act normal, but Amanda's sharp eyes often lingered on him, as if she could sense his growing suspicion. One afternoon, she caught him staring at her phone when it buzzed with a message. "Something on your mind, Jake?" she asked, her voice sweet but her eyes cold. "No," Jake replied quickly, looking away. "Just thinking about my science project." Amanda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good. It's important to stay focused on the right things." Jake's stomach twisted as she walked away. He was certain she knew something was up, and it made the stakes feel higher than ever. One evening, while Michael was working late, Amanda received a call. Jake and Mr. Hargrove watched through the hidden camera as Amanda's demeanor shifted. She spoke in a low, clipped tone, pacing the living room. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing," she said. "We're on track for the wedding. Once that's done, we move forward. Just make sure everything's ready on your end." Jake's palms sweated as Amanda sat down, her face a mask of calm. Suddenly, she turned her head sharply toward the bookshelf where the camera was hidden. Jake's breath caught as she stood, walking toward it. She reached out, fingers brushing against the edge of the shelf, but stopped as her phone buzzed again. She picked it up, reading the message, and walked out of the room. Jake exhaled shakily. "That was too close," he whispered to Mr. Hargrove, who nodded grimly. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Jake was digging through Amanda's files when he stumbled upon an encrypted folder on her laptop. It took some clever guessing and Mr. Hargrove's tech know-how to crack it open. Inside were detailed plans outlining Amanda's scheme to marry Michael, claim his life insurance, and disappear with the payout. There were even forged documents implicating Jake as a troublesome child, likely to deflect suspicion. "This is it," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice tense. "This is the proof we need." Jake felt both relief and dread. They had what they needed, but exposing Amanda wouldn't be easy. She was dangerous, and the closer they got to her wedding day, the more desperate she would become. "We'll wait for the right moment," Mr. Hargrove said. "When she's least expecting it, we'll bring her down." Jake nodded, steeling himself. The plan was set, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. The house was a whirlwind of preparations, flowers arriving, catering finalized, and Amanda basking in the attention of being the bride-to-be. Jake, however, could barely contain the knot of tension in his chest. With every passing hour, the stakes grew higher, and Amanda seemed more dangerous than ever. One evening, Jake was helping Mr. Hargrove review the files they'd uncovered when Amanda called him into the kitchen. Her tone was light, but her sharp gaze pierced through him as he entered. "Jake," she said sweetly, "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time next door. What's Mr. Hargrove teaching you, HM? Detective work?" Jake's heart pounded, but he forced a nonchalant shrug. "He's just showing me old case files. He used to be a detective, right?" "It's cool." Amanda's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, make sure it doesn't distract you from helping with the wedding. Your dad is counting on you." "Got it," Jake said, trying to sound casual as he backed out of the room. He knew she was suspicious, and the thought made his blood run cold. She was watching him more closely now, and any slip-up could ruin everything. The night before the wedding, Jake's worst fears came true. Amanda caught him in the act of sneaking into her room again. He'd been trying to retrieve one last piece of evidence, but had misjudged her whereabouts. She appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and a dangerously calm expression on her face. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice low and menacing. Jake froze, clutching a folder he'd just pulled from her drawer. I was spare me the excuses," Amanda snapped, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. She loomed over him, her eyes glinting with malice. "You've been snooping around for weeks, haven't you? What did you think you'd find?" Jake's mind raced, searching for an escape. "I just wanted to know more about you," he stammered. You're going to be my stepmom, and I thought—" Amanda's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, spare me the act, Jake. You're too clever for your own good. But let me make one thing clear. If you so much as breathe a word of this to your father, you'll regret it." She snatched the folder from his hands, her grip tight enough to make him wince. "Go back to bed and stay out of my way." Jake left the room, his heart racing and tears pricking his eyes. He'd underestimated her, and now she knew he was on to her. But he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Jake's heart. Guests began arriving, filling the house with laughter and chatter. Amanda was the picture of perfection in her flowing white gown. But Jake couldn't shake the image of her cold, threatening glare from the night before. Mr. Hargrove pulled Jake aside as the ceremony drew closer. "Everything's set," he said quietly. "I've got the footage ready and the police are on standby. As soon as we expose her, they'll move in." Jake nodded, his stomach churning with nerves. The plan was risky, but it was their best shot at stopping Amanda before it was too late. The ceremony began, the guests rising as Amanda walked down the aisle. Jake stood at his father's side, clutching the ring pillow so tightly his knuckles turned white. The officiant's voice droned on, but all Jake could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be married, speak now or forever hold your peace," the officiant said. This was it. Jake took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. "I do." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to him. Amanda's face darkened, her mask of sweetness slipping as she glared at him. "Jake," Michael said, his voice full of confusion. "What are you doing?" "Dad, I can't let you marry her," Jake said, his voice quivering but resolute. "She's lying to you. She's planning to hurt you." Amanda's laughter was sharp and scornful. "Oh, what nonsense. He's just a jealous child who doesn't want to share his daddy." "That's not true," Jake shot back. "I have proof." He turned to Mr. Hargrove, who stepped forward with a USB drive. "This contains recordings and documents proving everything Jake's saying. Amanda isn't who she claims to be." The tension in the room was palpable as the footage began to play. Amanda's cold voice filling the air as she outlined her plan to Victor. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the crowd, and Michael's face turned pale with shock. Amanda's expression hardened. Without a word, she turned and bolted down the aisle, her dress billowing behind her. But the police were ready, blocking her escape before she reached the door. Jake watched as Amanda was led away in handcuffs, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. His father knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. I'm so sorry, Jake," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I should have listened to you." Jake hugged him back, tears streaming down his face. "I just didn't want to lose you, Dad." The nightmare was over, but Jake knew their lives would never be the same. Together they'd rebuild, stronger and wiser for the trials they'd faced. The police escorted Amanda out of the church as the guests sat in stunned silence. Michael still knelt beside Jake, his arm wrapped protectively around his son. The air felt heavy with disbelief, the ornate decorations and soft candlelight now seeming out of place in the chaos that had unfolded. As Amanda was led away, her voice rang out in a venomous hiss. "You'll regret this, Jake. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine, but he stood firm. He met her glare with a determined stare of his own. "You'll never hurt my dad. Not ever." Once Amanda was gone, the guests began to murmur, some expressing shock, others sympathy. Michael turned to Jake, his face a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Jake, I should have believed you. I'm so sorry." Jake shook his head. "It's okay, Dad. I just didn't want anything bad to happen to you." Before Michael could respond, Mr. Hargrove approached, his expression serious. "Michael, there's something you need to know," he said. "Amanda wasn't working alone. Victor Kane is still out there, and he won't let this go quietly." Michael's jaw tightened. "What do we do?" Mr. Hargrove glanced at Jake, his tone resolute. "We stay vigilant, and we don't let our guard down." Hours later, as the remaining guests departed and the church grew quiet, Michael, Jake, and Mr. Hargrove sat in the rectory with two detectives. The USB drive had provided enough evidence to corroborate Jake's claims, but Victor's involvement complicated matters. "Victor Kane is dangerous," one detective explained. "He's been linked to several high-profile scams, but this is the first time we've had concrete evidence against him. He'll know Amanda's arrest puts him at risk." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. "What if he tries to hurt us?" The detective gave him a reassuring look. We'll assign officers to keep an eye on your house, and we're putting out an APB on Kane. He won't get far." That night, back at their home, the unease lingered. Michael double-checked the locks on every door and window, while Jake sat in the living room, his mind racing. Despite the police's reassurances, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was still watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jake's fears were confirmed. A faint noise outside his window made him freeze. He crept to the curtain and peeked through a crack. A shadow moved near the edge of their yard, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably male. Jake's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and dialed Mr. Hargrove. "Someone's outside," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Stay calm," Mr. Hargrove said. "Lock your door and wake your dad. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Jake nodded, hanging up before rushing to Michael's room. He shook his father awake, his voice urgent. "Dad, someone's in the yard." Michael sat up instantly, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a baseball bat from the corner of the room. Jake watched as his father crept toward the front door, his movements careful and deliberate. The house felt eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside. Jake's pulse quickened when he saw the shadow move closer to the house. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and Mr. Hargrove stormed in, a flashlight in one hand and a phone in the other. "Police are on their way," he announced, his voice steady. He moved to the window, shining the flashlight into the yard. The beam landed on a figure crouched near the bushes. The man turned, his face partially illuminated. It was Victor. He bolted toward the fence, but the sound of approaching sirens made him hesitate. Seconds later, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the house and officers poured out, guns drawn. "Freeze," one officer commanded. Victor hesitated for a moment before raising his hands in surrender. Jake watched from the window, his chest heaving with a mix of fear and relief. They had him. The danger was over. By dawn, the house was quiet again, the tension finally lifting. Michael pulled Jake into a hug, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us, Jake. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jake hugged him back, feeling the weight of the past few days finally begin to ease. "I just wanted us to be okay, Dad." As the sun rose, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, Jake felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. The nightmare was over, and for the first time he could look forward to a future free of fear. The morning light streamed through the living room windows as the Matthews family, now free of Amanda and Victor, sat together, a quiet sense of relief settling over them. The past few weeks had been harrowing, but Jake's bravery and determination had brought the truth to light, ensuring their safety. Michael sat on the couch beside Jake, holding a steaming mug of coffee. His face still showed traces of exhaustion, but his eyes held a newfound appreciation for his son. "Jake, I don't know how I missed all the signs. If it weren't for you," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It's okay, Dad," Jake replied softly. "I just didn't want to lose you." Amanda, she fooled everyone. Mr. Hargrove, seated in the armchair across from them, chimed in. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Michael. People like Amanda and Victor are experts at manipulation. What matters is that you and Jake are safe now, and they're behind bars." Later that day, the detectives handling the case stopped by to provide an update. Amanda had confessed to her role in the scheme, but it was Victor who remained defiant. When cornered by police in a dramatic pursuit, he had revealed just how dangerous he truly was. The chase had begun 2 nights earlier when Victor, tipped off to Amanda's arrest, fled town. A statewide alert was issued, and officers spotted him driving a stolen black sedan at high speed along a winding mountain road. When they attempted to pull him over, Victor accelerated, veering recklessly around hairpin turns. The pursuit lasted nearly an hour, with Victor's car eventually crashing through a barricade and tumbling into a ravine. Miraculously, he survived and emerged from the wreckage armed with a knife. Cornered, he slashed wildly at the approaching officers, screaming about how he wouldn't go down alone. In a final act of desperation, Victor tried to use a civilian's parked car to escape, but officers tackled him before he could get the engine started. He was subdued after a tense struggle, leaving several officers injured, but none seriously harmed. The level of violence and determination he displayed shocked even seasoned detectives. "He's as dangerous as they come," one detective told Michael and Jake. "If we hadn't caught him when we did, there's no telling what he might have done." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. "So it's over now? He can't hurt us anymore?" The detective nodded. "He'll be behind bars for a long time. You don't have to worry about him." At the police station, Amanda sat in a holding cell, her expression calm and calculating. A faint smile played on her lips as she addressed the officer standing guard. "Bad luck, that's all this was," she said, her voice smooth. Victor was careless. "Next time, things will be different." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Next time? You're going away for a long time." Amanda laughed softly. "You think bars can hold someone like me? People make mistakes, officer. And when they do, there's always someone like me waiting to take advantage." Her lack of remorse sent a chill through those who heard her. Amanda didn't see herself as a criminal to her. She was simply smarter than everyone else. And this time, she'd been unlucky. Her words hinted at an unshakable confidence that she'd eventually find a way to freedom. As the days turned into weeks, life began to return to normal. Michael and Jake worked together to reclaim their sense of stability. Michael decided to take a break from dating, focusing instead on strengthening his relationship with Jake. They spent more time together, going on hikes, working on projects, and simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael turned to Jake. "You know, I've always known you were smart, but I never realized how brave you are. You've taught me so much, Jake." Jake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I guess I just wanted to make sure we were okay." "We're a team, right?" "Always," Michael replied, ruffling Jake's hair. On the day of Amanda and Victor's trial, Michael and Jake arrived at the courthouse together. Jake felt a mix of nerves and determination as he took the stand, recounting the events that had led to their capture. His testimony, coupled with the evidence Mr. Hargrove had helped gather, left no doubt about their guilt. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Jake felt a wave of relief. The nightmare was finally over. Months later, life for the Matthews family had taken on a new rhythm. Jake thrived at school, his confidence bolstered by the knowledge that he could handle even the toughest challenges. Michael, too, had changed. He was more attentive, more present, and more determined than ever to be the best father he could be. On a sunny Saturday morning, Michael and Jake packed a picnic and headed to the park. They laughed as they played catch, their bond stronger than ever. As they sat under a sprawling oak tree, Jake looked at his father, a question lingering in his mind. "Dad, do you think there are more people like Amanda and Victor out there?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "Probably. But the important thing is to trust your instincts and always speak up if something feels wrong. You did that, Jake, and you saved us." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of empowerment. "I'll always protect us, Dad, no matter what." Michael smiled, pulling Jake into a hug. "And I'll always protect you. Together we can face anything." As they packed up their picnic and headed home, the past few months felt like a distant memory. The future was bright, and the Matthews family was ready to face it, together. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.